Thank you for joining us. Number one, loved hearing the interest in this on all these topics. But I'm the CEO and co-founder of Delivering Happiness, which is basically started as a book back in the day in 2010. Tony Hsieh, the CEO of Zappos, and I launched it without thinking it was going to be anything else but a book. And lo and behold, it just kind of took off, and we sensed there was a tipping point of happiness in the world. So that's why we decided to evolve it into the company is today. So we do culture consulting, and yeah, got a lot of years since 2010 to hopefully share a lot of the lessons learned of what we've seen in the culture space to help you where you're at with your business.
Awesome. And yeah, you'll might see Jen flying somewhere to speak about DH and what we do to multiple organizations around the world, or certain events, just inspiring people to figure out how to bring more happiness into their business or their organization or what they're doing. So for me, I am Bree. I am part of the marketing team at DH. I kind of manage the marketing content at Delivering Happiness, but in a way that hopefully speaks to everyone on this webinar, addressing your pain points, what you might be thinking when it comes to culture, and hopefully answering those questions for you. And I guess one of my newer responsibilities is hosting these webinars, so that's been really cool. But yeah, you might see my face a little bit more, and I think my face is in a couple of your emails reminding you about this webinar, but hopefully you'll see me more. So far, it's been fun.
Right. Thanks for taking on another hat in the organization.
Yeah. So let's roll through our top pain points here. Let me see if it'll let me do it. There we go. So looking at the list of the pain points that we received from everybody, we kind of put them into three general categories, but we are going to dive deeper into each one of those. So first, putting culture into practice. Second is scaling culture. And third is employee engagement, which is a really big all-encompassing one as well. But let's go ahead, and I'll leave this slide up so, through the discussion, you can reference these pain points to follow which one we're talking about. But the first one is going to be putting culture into practice. So Jen, I don't know if you would like to start introing this one.
Yeah, so this is definitely top of mind on with a lot of conversations I'm having these days. And essentially, well, actually, let me back up a little bit just to kind of from a meta point of view, because culture, I feel, is like a term that's being used so much and over the years keeps on changing, and everyone kind of has their own definition. So I kind of want to be clear from our perspective on what we mean by culture. So how I've been breaking it down is we look at, when you got a business, that the strategy essentially is the way you think, brand is what you say, and culture is what you do. And kind of joke around, half jokingly, this culture is what you do behind when your boss isn't looking. So kind of framing in the sense of like how we constantly want to keep these things into mind, how culture is just not HR anymore. It's a lot more strategic than that. So that's kind of from a holistic point of view. And our belief is that if you get these three things, like strategy, brand, and culture in harmony, that's when happiness happens. And that's a kind of trying to riff off a quote of one of my favorite leaders in the space, Mahatma Gandhi, when he said that what you think, say, and do are in harmony, that is happiness. And so for us, when brand and strategy and culture are in harmony, that equals happiness. So that's kind of the meta when we talk about culture, but how do you actually put it into practice? So when I was thinking about this pain point, I was thinking about the early days of Zappos, because back then, it was this early 2000s. We weren't really calling it culture yet, but what we were trying to do is just focus on people. Essentially, how do you scale a company based on the priority of people? And so since those days, and it's been like 15, 17 years now, I realized it came back to this equation that we use at Delivering Happiness. It's basically, if you have happier employees, that equals happier customers, and that equals a more profitable, sustainable business. But more importantly, you're also creating meaningful lives. And when I say meaningful lives, it's within your teams, within your customer base, within your partners and vendors, and also, actually, most importantly, within yourself. So when I say that equation, a lot of times, people nod their heads at like, yeah, of course that makes sense. But then the biggest question becomes how? And I think that's what the pain point is talking to, is like, how do you put this notion of culture into action and practice and reality? And I think that's where we've been testing a lot of ways to go about this, is like, how do you take, this great higher purpose or mission statement, and your list of values that are sitting pretty on the wall, but how do you actually take it into, live action on a day-to-day basis? Most importantly, in an authentic way and in a sustainable way. So I think that's kind of the point of what this is, in taking those words. And what we do is, because as again, like, everyone's got values now, which is great, because, back in the early days, values were still a little weird or just a little too corporate, but now every organization has it. So how to make it real, one of the things that we always encourage is to take it to a specific actionable behavior. So taking a set of values, whatever it is, and actually whatever they are, and defining specific behaviors out of those values is like one of the primary steps in being able to start making them live authentically in any organization.
Yeah, so just to pause on that, I wanted to follow up and ask, like, what could be an example of like a value matched up with the behavior? Maybe.
Yeah. So we call it V2B, so values to behavior. So an example would be a company we worked out. It's an accounting / financial services company called WIS on the East Coast. So they basically distilled their values to 5 of them, and one of them was relationships. And so if you can imagine, relationships on the wall just kind of doesn't really mean that much, but what they did was actually defined it to specific behaviors. So one behavior out of that was to connect with compassion and communicate consciously. So that in itself makes it a little bit more concrete, or a lot more concrete, as to what relationships mean in the organization. And what that also does for the company is that you can make it more black and white, so then you can actually be accountable for it and measured on it, so that someone that's not living by that particular behavior, therefore value, can be called out on it and say, hey, this is something that we saw in the meeting last week, and therefore it's something that we need to work on. So that's where it becomes a little bit more, concrete in a way to action makes it actionable and measurable.
Yeah, so one of the things about kind of having accountability when it comes to living your values at work, it could be a little bit awkward for some people to have those conversations.
Yeah.
Especially, I guess, when leadership, maybe they're not always like 100% living by them, or, it's difficult, especially in the beginning when you're changing your culture up a little bit. So maybe you can go over what 360 feedback might be as a way to be transparent in measuring people living their values, because I think it takes a lot of the awkwardness out of it.
Yeah, it definitely does. And I think, it's a good point that you bring up in terms of like how to make sure we can measure and be accountable for, because essentially one of the biggest gaps that we found of companies that spend a lot of time and money to invest into their culture programs, and then they find out, wait, why aren't people living by them? So to like kind of a corollary to what you're talking about, is like, how do you actually make sure it's lived in a sustainable way? And one of the things that we say is to embed it into organizational systems. And so attaching these values and behaviors to your systems, like recruiting, hiring, firing, onboarding, incentives and rewards and recognition. People often ask like, okay, well, how do you make sure it's sustainable? We say, well, embed it in your systems. And what you're talking about, Bree, is doing the measurement part of it so you know whether or not people are actually living by it. And the 360 part of it is that it's not just the manager or the boss saying, yes, you're living by them or you're not. It's everyone that this person interacts with, top down, bottom up, within the teams, cross-functionally, et cetera. They all have a say in giving this, 360 evaluation of whether or not this person is truly living by that value or they think they are. So it's kind of a nice way to say perception versus reality.
Awesome. So I want to take a couple minutes here to just stop and see if there are any questions that we can answer about this pain point of putting culture into practice. So there is a Q&A button on your Zoom. So if you're an attendee, there's a Q&A button available. So just go ahead and click that and send us a question, and we'll just take a couple minutes here to just pause and see before we move on to the next one. So I'll make sure that we grab them while we can. Cool. But while you ponder on some questions, I do want to kind of push Jenn to talk a little bit more about a client of ours that really is a great example of putting culture into practice and putting those values into like a full culture rollout strategy. So that's Northwell Health. So Jenn, can you talk about that a bit?
Yeah, so the context of putting culture into practice for them, so Northwell, they're like a consortium of hospitals up in New York, and they have I think they're about to 60,000 employees now, over 30 hospitals. So, pretty large, one of the largest healthcare systems in the US. And so what's interesting here is that they already had values and like a sense of culture, but no one was living it. And I think what's especially interesting is because when you're in healthcare, the sense of purpose is pretty clear. You're working there because you want to make sure you want to keep people healthy, or that's why you got into, to be a nurse, or why you want to be a doctor. So what was like ironic is that there's a high sense of purpose, but employees were unhappy, and therefore patients were unhappy, and therefore their scores were really low across the board. And so they decided to address it with culture. And the CEO hired in another CEO, but as the chief experience officer. And what he did, his name is Sven, and what's really cool about his background is that he's actually from Ritz-Carlton, and so it brought like the hospitality aspect into healthcare. So they decided to focus on culture, and they took their original laundry list of core values, distilled it into 4. So they created a culture of care, which is 4 words of compassion, awareness, respect, and empathy. And then it became really clear to everyone, no matter who you're working at what level in the hospital, that everyone was accountable to live a culture of care. And by doing that, they made these words on the wall actually live and put it into practice, so that people were actually measured by it and accountable for it. But they were just reminded, I think most importantly, of their original purpose. They came into this field because they care about people. And so to have it embedded in their everyday culture and language, it became a reminder. And it was really interesting. Like, one of the stories I love from this was that they originally thought the doctors would be most, apprehensive about, my job is tough enough. Now I have to do this. I care about culture. But then they realized that doctors actually embraced it the most, because again, I think it went back to the reminder that they were originally there to care for another person and care for their patients. So as a result, they actually have engagement scores that went from 45% to like 80% over the course of 2 years, which, for a healthcare system, it's pretty amazing. They had, we did this whole executive alignment session across 300 leaders, just things that you never really think could happen in a relative short amount of time. And they were able to put culture into practice, which was pretty cool to see, especially in healthcare space, because it's challenging. Every space is challenging, but
yeah, it's definitely challenging, especially when you hear about burnout being such a huge problem in the healthcare space, and trying to bring people back to being passionate about their work and empathetic and wanting to connect with others when you're so used to being jaded and having to kind of turn that off to do your job. It's really hard.
Yeah, I think that's a good point too, just the burnout, because like every company has burnout.
Yeah.
And so just to see that you can address that using, culture principles is pretty cool to see.
Yeah. So I wanted to move forward into, there are a couple questions that we got that I'm waiting on some clarification on, but I want to move forward into our second pain point, and I'll be monitoring the Q&A as well. But talking about scaling culture. Okay, this is a pretty common question because everyone in the beginning has such a good culture when they start their business, or maybe there's like one headquarters and they have a really good culture, but then once they start branching out, expanding, have new locations, that's when there's, I guess, some trouble. So could you speak a little bit about that, Jenn?
Yeah, so I guess the first pain point that we heard from everyone on this webinar was like putting it in place. And then the second one is kind of the natural next step of like, okay, we have it in place. And then, okay, wait, how do we scale this thing? So I would say that being at that point, being in that position is a good problem to have, because that means your company is growing, your company's adding more locations, or you're adding more service lines or products. Basically, you're adding more people to your team. So it's kind of like kudos to that. But then that's actually the number one pain point that got back at Zappos thinking about, wait, how do you scale this thing? And so what we've come to realize, the scalability part is so important for especially companies when they have inflection points. And so if you're a smaller organization, just give an example, through the years, I found that around 75 employees is when the scaling thing becomes really problematic, because you thought you had a great culture, and then all of a sudden, wait, that I don't even recognize people coming in doors anymore. And then it becomes a multiple of 75 as organizations get larger and larger. It's interesting to see the inflection point of when it is important to scale. When it is important to really focus to be able to scale. So one of the key learnings that we've had along the way is to take that foundational work that we were talking about of having a sense of what your higher purpose is, having a really well-defined set of values and behaviors, and then taking that and being able to scale using people. And that includes you can call it whatever you want, but it could be culture ambassadors, culture teams. And essentially what happens is that once you get leadership alignment from the top, we know that's not all it takes, because you want it, not just top bottom, but you want it bottom up as well. So once you get that alignment of those purpose, values, and behaviors, and then also look around your organization, like who are the natural leaders of culture, then they become the natural culture ambassadors that aren't tasked to do it, but they're really passionate and want to do it. So by embedding these people across the organization, and even if you have different locations, if you're a multinational company, then you do it around the world, then you actually see that it's being lived in a more sustainable and adaptable way. And when I say adaptable, that's a really key point, because we can all develop a core foundation of what our values are and what our higher purpose is. The reality is that, especially as you grow and have different locations around the world, let's just say, there's going to be subcultures, and you want to embrace that. And that's where you have the foundational piece set in stone, because that's your DNA of what your company is. But then you can let these locations, or you can let different teams make it their own, in their own subculture. And this also applies within an organization that doesn't have multiple locations, because HR and finance and your engineering team, they're all going to look at these differently, and you want to embrace the fact that they're all going to behave different ways, but at least you have that foundation of what you establish before you scale.
Yeah, so piggybacking off of that, you know, it's always nerve-wracking to see maybe culture, you know, as it adapts and changes, especially when you scale, trying to also control certain things to maintain it. So
Yes.
I wanted to segue into a question that we got from Hercules that kind of touches on this in a surface level way, but I want to go deeper into it. So he's asking, you know, are there any tips that we can use to make 360 feedback or any other kind of checks in place more accurate and avoid people trading in positive reviews with their friends or their, you know, best friend, coworker?
Yeah.
I think that we could address that a little bit deeper too.
Yeah. I think that's actually something that came up recently with Facebook because they do 360s. But first of all, I want to say Hercules, what a name. I mean, it was amazing growing up having a name like Hercules.
I know.
So yeah, that Facebook just got called out for that because, you know, they were like been saying, hey, we're big on culture, we do 360s. And then that exact point came up where we're like, well, people were getting annoyed because yeah, their best friends would give them great evaluations. So I think with 360s, it's so important to be mindful and intentional of who's 360ing the other person. And it can't be on the onus of just one person. It can't be, of course, like I'm going to determine who's going to evaluate me. I think it needs to be between the manager and other people on the team to come together to try to actually come up with a good formula of picking the right people. So it's not the people that they're just the best friends with, but people that actually work with on a day-to-day basis, maybe in a different function or different location that not necessarily has developed a friendship with them, but they have to interact with them on a day-to-day basis. And sometimes people have the question of, do we make it anonymous or should we be completely transparent? And I think it speaks to this because I think it depends on your culture. I think some cultures can be totally transparent and be okay because there's being, you know, real honest communication there. But I think a lot of cultures, and in this case, probably Facebook, that need some sort of anonymity for true 360 feedback to come in to be evaluated. And I think 360 needs to be both quantitative and qualitative too.
Oh yeah.
Across the board.
Cool. Well, Hercules, I hope we answered your question there, but I'm sure we answered other people's questions too. I do want to touch about one more that we got from Claudia. And Claudia, we might want to expand on this after the webinar as a follow-up to you. But she's basically asking, like, what, especially when it comes to scaling or putting culture into practice, like, how do we embed it? Like, where should we start? Should it be like onboarding for employees? Is it, you know, do we have evaluations that are like 360 feedback to really embed it? Is it, are there other, is there a methodology to it that we would recommend?
So just to understand the question more, I just want to make sure I understand. To embed, like where to start embedding?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. Yeah, I think this is like the classic answer, right? It all depends, but it does really all depend because I think like your organization tells you where to start. And how do you find out those answers is, you know, you could do a survey or you can have, you know, one-on-one interviews or, you know, there's a whole slew of ways to just basically get feedback from your teams or your whole company and actually like listen to it. And you can, you know, slice and dice the data if you want, but essentially just to make it simple, once you can do this through engagement surveys, but there's tons of tools now, but like just simplify the thing. When you get the results back, like celebrate the things that are going well. And then like, you know, what are the top 3 things that, hey, let's celebrate this. And what are the top 3 things that like, these are the, like, this is what makes people not want to come to work. So I think based on the feedback, that's how we can better prioritize where to start. So if the thorn in the side is like, we're not retaining enough people, like people are just dropping like flies because they're getting burned out, then let's just focus on that first and understand where the issues are and start addressing them. So I think it's mostly like listen to the organization as to what they're telling you, people.
Yeah, because it does vary company, but that's why to really get in there, at least for DH, right, we do both quantitative work and qualitative to really understand the organization, because every single one's different, but you can still apply basically all of the model that we use to all the different ones.
Yeah, and I think that what's even, to that point, and what's even more exciting about when you do this based on survey results, and you have the qualitative and you have the quantitative, that means what you're essentially doing is like drawing a line in the sand and taking a picture of your culture, of your company. And then once you have a sense, so it's basically, this is when you start benchmarking for progress. And so if let's say retention was your biggest issue, let's say retention was at 50%, and you decided, okay, we need to focus on this. Then after you launch these sort of culture initiatives, then you can actually take another snapshot in a quarter or 2 quarters and so on down the line, and be able to show the progress and essentially the measurability / ROI of what culture can do for an organization. So you can, as a leader in your company, say, hey, before we did all this stuff, we were at 50%. And after we did all this stuff, people started staying longer for another 6 months, a year, 2 years. And then it becomes a black and white sense of measurable ROI, which is kind of like the nice addition to basing it on priorities of surveys, et cetera.
Cool. And diving into ROI a little bit more and kind of establishing what the ROI of a culture is, which is a big question all the time. We also look at employee engagement, which is the third pain point that we want to go over before we end this webinar. And also one of our favorite client stories at that. But so Jenn, for employee engagement, since it's a very all-encompassing term, like how do we define it here at DH for our clients?
Yeah, so it's almost like culture's used so widely, engagement's used so widely, and I feel that for us, engagement kind of is like, in the past has been looked like a number, like where's our engagement now? It's almost like, where's our growth now? Where's our revenue now? Where's our engagement now? And I think that's a little bit too limited in its definition. It's kind of, engagement is more about experience, I think, from how we've been integrating it into our frameworks. So essentially it's the experience of an employee, and you can look at it in just the everyday, but you can also look at it, if you're financially minded, you can look at it as like the employee lifetime value instead of just the customer lifetime value. So if you're tracking the life cycle of an employee's experience in your company, that's engagement, because it comes from the day they step into the door, even before they're hired. So that process to the onboarding, to training, and all the way to the end of, hopefully, when that person leaves a long time later. So that's where we want to broaden where engagement is, but being specific to where we've come from in our models. One of the frameworks we use is me, we, and community. So if you can imagine me in the middle as a concentric circle, and then it's we, and then community. Engagement, I feel, is when all those things coexist with me starting in the middle, because you want every single person coming into your doors, in your office, or if you're remote, to their laptop to feel like they themselves are connected to the we of the team and the company, and essentially connected to the community of your customers, your partners and vendors. And the whole alignment there is that the me is connected to your organization's higher purpose and values, because they actually believe it themselves for their everyday life. So I think that's a huge part of how we differentiate what engagement is. It's not just like, like throwing some happy hour thing so people are engaged in that or engaged in their everyday work. It's just something a little bit more, I think, deeper in themselves.
Yeah, and you can see kind of the results of you're having engaged employees throughout the organization in different ways. So I wanted to roll into talking a little bit about Campa and how they've seen the effect of, their purpose and values being lived through their employees and how it's kind of really trickled out into their community from the me and the we level too.
Yeah, so Campa, this one of the most amazing stories that I've seen of a company that just really wanted to figure out how culture could change their company. And I think this story it could be applicable to anyone that's listening to this or watching this webinar, because I think as companies, in every stage that we all kind of experience these things in the lifeline of our company. So here's a company, 31 years old, based out in Turkey, and they were struggling. They're going through there was political stuff going on in the country itself, but also for the company, they were having to deal with a lot of turnover, couldn't attract any sort of good talent. Business was going down. They were on basically the brink of downsizing, if not shutting down in a few years. So here's a VP that was one of the owners of the company and been with the company for a long time. And he actually didn't even want to show up at work anymore. And he looked around and he looked at his teams and they didn't want to show up at work anymore. So I think he stumbled upon the book. I think that's what Murat did. And he read the book and he got super excited. He's like, well, I have nothing else to lose, so I might as well try and invest in culture. So he came over to San Francisco and did this whole 3-day masterclass with us, took the learnings back, and it was the most incredible thing. 10 months later, I get this email from him, and it's literally the longest email I've ever read in my life. It was just line by line describing all the things that have changed, all the things that he did to get engagement up. And it was just I was so moved by it because he did it on his own to be able to scale across this whole organization and get and basically turn into 180. So examples of the outcomes, super excited. He was like, went from 60 to 600 applicants per month. Turnover actually went from 30% to negative because people started coming back because they realized we're working on culture. Their revenues were the highest ever in the 31-year history, doubling year over year. And the last email that we got from him, which was so super amazing, was that they announced that they were awarded the #1 great places to work in Turkey, alongside companies like H&M and Microsoft and Hilton. So it was a super cool success story, but I think to be specific about this pain point, how to get people engaged, here's a few things they did, which I thought were pretty cool. #1, they started introducing optimism into meetings. So before diving into the agenda, they would go around the room and ask people just to share something positive about how did this colleague wow me, and sharing more positive stories. And from that alone, the VP noticed that it changed the whole sort of energy in the room. It became much more collaborative, and they brought it back to their desks in terms of then they had a more optimistic look in the way they did their everyday work. They also did something really cool where they printed new business cards. And they did this after they had everyone do a core value exercise. So they said, hey, of all these core values that we have in the company, what's your favorite core value? And so they basically printed that core value on individuals' business cards. And the VP said that it just changed so much in the dynamic of business relationships, because all of a sudden salespeople didn't have to sell the product anymore. They were just the customer was just enamored by this. Wow, your company actually cares about your core value. and they found that their customers were asking whether they were hiring so that they can get a job at Campa. So it's just little things like that that seem little, but ultimately add up to the greater, bigger picture of what culture is. And it just showed that they, now they're one of the best, great places to work in Turkey. So that was cool to see.
Yeah, and yeah, it's one of our favorite stories, but it continues to evolve. We still get their yearly culture books that they print out and give to all the employees, and we receive them too. And it's been really awesome to kind of see where their journey has taken them, especially adapting with different things maybe happening in their country or maybe in the field that they're in. It's been really awesome.
Yeah.
So we are gonna go ahead and quickly go over the next exercise. Well, the exercise that we wanted to review with everybody that you can bring to your teams even this week. It's really simple. So let me go ahead and share my screen real quick here. It's this one. Hope it's that one. All right. So this exercise is actually from our ebook. So the full ebook, you can download it at the bit.ly link. So it's bit.ly/happy ebook. But this is a little sample that we took from it. We call it the Peck Walk. Oh, that's one of what I call it, at least. And it's an exercise you can take to your team, even at your next meeting. You basically just pair people off, or groups of threes, but relatively small groups. And then you say group one has question number one, and this group has question number two. And you can make questions on your own too, but the ones that you see here are from our ebook, and they kind of dive deeper than just the surface level questions that you normally would discuss with a coworker. So number one, group one would probably go over who has been the greatest influence in your life. And the point here is to ask this group or this pair to get together for your next meeting and just take a walk with one another. Discuss this question, share ideas back and forth, and share experiences. And then at your next team meeting, ask them, how do they feel going into this exercise? Usually it's kind of uneasy, maybe it's a little uncomfortable, but then how do they feel coming out of it? And what do they feel like today approaching work or approaching that colleague? So that's just a little bit that you can take with you for your next team meeting. But of course, you can use the full ebook at the link, and it's also in the chat box here. But let us know how that goes. We're always interested to see how teams can use this to start building on connectedness in their own workplace in a way that's a little bit more meaningful. And from there, you can really start to see changes in little ways of how people will want to collaborate more or are a little bit more approachable with one another. And that's kind of where it starts at the individual level. So we're pretty much wrapped up here. We did get another couple questions, but if you do have more questions that we didn't answer, we'll shoot this email in the chat box, but you can email April, like the month April, at deliveringhappiness.com. That is the email address of one of our teammates who can help connect you with more resources that can help you out with those questions and get some answers from the team for you too. So what's next is we're going to be just following up with the recording via email. And so feel free to share that with your teams. We'd love to hear some feedback from everybody, but thank you for joining us, and we're pretty much wrapped up here.
Thanks. Yeah, thank you for everyone's time. Hopefully there's something you could take away. We're all about actionable, immediate things that you can start seeing like tomorrow. So like what Bree was saying with the Peck Walk, PEC, personal emotional connection, we'd love to hear how that goes for you or any other questions that you have. So thank you so much for everyone's time.
All right, thanks everybody. Have a good day, all right?
Thank you, Bree.